Hey guys, it's Cass. Hope you're all doing well. I have a very special and daunting video to film for you guys today. I'm going to be talking about Rachel Cusk, who is my favorite author. I always mention how much I love her on this channel, but I haven't really had a chance to talk about her super in depth because I read a lot of her books back in like 2022 and 2023 before I started this channel, and I had a lot of people comment saying that a video talking about where to start with Cusk would be really helpful, so I wanted to do that for you guys today. And then she also has a new book coming out on June 18th called Parade, which I received on NetGalley from FSG and have read twice in the past 2 weeks. So once we talk about my kind of overall Cusk journey and where I think that you should start with her, we will talk in depth about Parade. I feel very confident in my ability to talk about my journey with Cusk and kind of my thoughts on her as an author, but I feel a little bit less prepared to talk about Parade, so we'll see how it goes. Hopefully the notes that I took while I was reading will be of use to me during this. So yes, Rachel Cusk is my favorite author. She's the author that I've read the most in my reading lifetime, which is really crazy to think about. But she's not my favorite author simply because I've had like 5-star perfect experiences with all of her books. In fact, I've had a lot of like mixed experiences with her books, but she is just someone that I find so fascinating and someone who I want to understand her, and I want to understand how all of her works kind of come together and create this overall Cusk collection, if you will. I see myself returning to her books often as I progress in life. I feel like she's someone that I will come to enjoy more and more the more that I reread her and think about her and just kind of gain different experiences in life. And yeah, I just feel like my understanding will only deepen with time. She's kind of a project author in that sense for me, where I plan on reading all of her books and plan on keeping up with whatever she comes out with, and I'm just really excited to have an author that I feel that kind of connection with. So I wanted to talk about the books that I've read from her in the order that I've read them. I'm not going to give you my star ratings from back whenever I read these because I feel like I don't 100% trust my past self's like opinions and ratings of these. Like I said, I read a lot of these before I started this channel, before I even really started writing any sort of reviews for books. So I don't have a lot of my actual thoughts during the reading experience documented for these. I just have star ratings on Goodreads, and I just feel like the way that I rate books now and think about books now is a lot different. So I feel like just giving you the big picture of my general thoughts on each book is going to be a better way to do this. The first Rachel Cusk that I ever read was Outline. I read it for the first time in November of 2021, and it was literally the 7th book that I read whenever I got back into reading as an adult. So this came very early on in my current journey. I feel like I use that word a lot, but it's fine. I had heard a lot of hype about it. I was kind of just starting to watch BookTube and, you know, get other people's opinions about books. I had found a different edition of this. It's like the one with like the notebook paper cover and like the corner is like folded down, and I think it has like the beach or something on it. I had found that edition at Half Price Books, and since I had heard so many people talk about it, I picked it up and decided to give it a try. And if you don't know anything about this book and the Outline trilogy in general, basically we're following our narrator Faye, and we really don't know too much about her. She just has these conversations with different people that she meets. In Outline specifically, she travels to Greece to teach a writing workshop, and we just see all of her conversations with different people that she meets, and she's really just sort of this like outline and like blank page that these other people are just telling their stories to, and we kind of get her thoughts and opinions based on how she reacts to them, but we don't really get too much about her own life or her own self. And when I read this for the first time in 2021, I remember feeling like there was something really intriguing about it, but I just wasn't fully there as far as understanding and loving it. I was like, there's something here, something good, but my brain just wasn't at the point that I could fully grasp it. And one of the things that I'm realizing, I feel like especially in 2024 this year with my reading, and I don't think that this is groundbreaking, but I'm really coming to this kind of conclusion that where you are in your reading experience and like the other books that you've read really dictate your experiences with other books. I'm really seeing it embodied in my reading this year, and I feel like that was the case with this book, where it was just so early on. I didn't really have any base knowledge of what she was trying to do with this book, and so it didn't fully resonate with me initially, but I knew that I wanted to continue reading more Rachel Cusk after my experience with this. So then fast forward like 8 months into July of 2022, and I picked up The Country Life. This is an earlier novel of Cusk's, and it's kind of this like coming of age, like finding yourself kind of story about a young woman who goes off to the English countryside. She leaves behind her family in the city. Oh, there's a humongous bug on my window. Ew. She becomes an au pair for a family in the country and looks after their young son. And I remember immediately upon picking this up, I loved it so much more than I loved Outline. The narrator, Stella, just had such a vibrant personality. She was very flawed and kind of awkward at times, but it was just so wonderful being in her brain for the duration of this book. And I just really loved it. I did give this 5 stars whenever I read it back in 2022. I'm sure that there were a lot of themes and things that Cusk was doing in this book that went over my head at the time that I would pick up on if I revisited it now, but I thought that this was just like a really enjoyable story, and it made me even more excited to continue reading Cusk. I then revisited Outline in August of 2022. I feel like I felt emboldened by my experience with The Country Life, and I was like, okay, maybe I just kind of missed something with Outline, but I feel like my thoughts on this largely stayed the same. I didn't love it as much as I loved The Country Life, but I wanted to read it in preparation to read the rest of the trilogy. And there is a reason why I did not enjoy this as much, which we'll kind of get into once I go through this whole list. Also in August of 2022, I read Aftermath, which is her memoir about her divorce. I read this when I was on vacation, so it was in the midst of a lot of other books because I am a mad woman when it comes to vacation reading. So yeah, I don't have a lot of like thoughts recorded about this. I do remember certain parts of it quite vividly, and I remember enjoying it, but this is a major contender for a reread for me because I do feel like this is one of her kind of like cornerstone works, and I just think it's so important in her journey as a writer, and it just talks about a lot of the themes that she explores in her fiction, but this is a memoir, so yeah, this one is like very important, I would say. And then in September of 2022, I read Transit. I'm telling you guys, 2022 was like the year of Cusk for me, and I don't think that I was fully prepared to take her on at that point, so excited to have these books to return to in the future. But I did actually note on Goodreads that this is my favorite of the Outline trilogy, which is funny to me because this is the one that I remember the least of. Looking back at it in preparation for this video though, I would say that this is kind of like a fictional counterpart to Aftermath. In this, Faye, the narrator, moves to London with her 2 sons and kind of tries to start rebuilding her life, which is very similar to what she was doing in Aftermath. I think it would have been a lot more beneficial for me if I read the entire trilogy like in quick succession. I was kind of sprinkling in other Cusks in between reading the books in the trilogy, and you know, I was taking my time in between them, and I find a lot with different series. I'm thinking of like Ali Smith's seasonal quartet. I think that it would be so much better if I had just read them all straight through, like one after another, just to really kind of get the overall vibe of what they're trying to do, and I feel the same way about the Outline trilogy. Then in November of 2022, I read The Temporary, which is also a really early novel of hers. I enjoyed this one. It was kind of giving like almost Sally Rooney vibes to me, just in the sense that it's dealing with these romantic relationships between these early 20-somethings, and they're kind of navigating their careers and their like dead-end jobs, and just like there's this really big theme of like miscommunication and misinterpretation between the two characters. So it was kind of giving Rooney in that sense. I feel like if you're into, you know, more like romancy kind of books, this would be like a good entry point into Cusk. And then finally in February of 2023, I finished the Outline trilogy with Kudos, and I have on Goodreads that this was my least favorite of the trilogy, which is hilarious to me because I feel like this is the one that I remember the most from. In this, Faye travels to an unnamed European country to attend a literary conference, and it's, you know, still the same kind of thing where we're getting all of her conversations with people that she is meeting at this conference, and the character of Faye is kind of being fleshed out by these stories. I think if you enjoy reading about writers and kind of these like behind the scenes, like cultural, literary scene things, this one would be really enjoyable, and I do think that I would enjoy it even more now. In May of 2023, I read Second Place. This one is one of her newer books. This is a novel about a woman who invites this artist to her home to stay. It is like this kind of epistolary form where the narrator is addressing this other character and telling him about the experience of this artist staying with her and her husband. This has a lot to do with art and painting, and I believe a lot of this was based on some stuff to do with D.H. Lawrence, who I'm not very familiar with, but I was reading an interview with Cusk about this book, and she was kind of talking a bit about the inspiration for it. Then in July of 2023, I read A Life's Work on Becoming a Mother. This is one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books in general. It made my top 10 list last year, and I just was so thought-provoked by this book. This received so much backlash whenever it was published back in, I believe, 2003. Just for the way that she is so candid and honest about her experience with becoming a mother. She really just gave you such a raw look into the struggles and the difficulties of it, and let me tell you, the people were not ready to talk about that whenever this book was published, and she just got so much criticism for it. But I think in today's kind of climate, this is like just a blueprint for a lot of things that a lot of authors are currently talking about. And yeah, I just feel like she was really ahead of her time with this. This like made me think so much about my life and where it's gonna go and whether or not to have children. And yeah, it was just like an experience to read this. So this is another one that I kind of see as a pillar of Cusk's catalog. Then in September of 2023, I read her essay collection, Coventry. This is, to me, one that is more just for the Cusk completionists. At first, whenever I was reading it, I was kind of thinking that it could be a good like introductory step into Cusk for some people, but after finishing it, I kind of retracted that thought just because I don't think that it was anything super groundbreaking. I thought that A Life's Work and Aftermath were much better pieces of nonfiction, you know, just more thematically cohesive and stronger writing. So I think it's one to get to later on in your Cusk journey. I wouldn't say that you have to go out and pick up Coventry right this second. And then in March of 2024, just a couple months ago, I read Arlington Park, which I absolutely loved. I talked more about this in my March wrap up, so you know, great that I actually have like documented, fleshed out thoughts about this one. This is about a group of mothers living in an English suburb, and it just kind of goes through a day in their lives and their frustrations and their struggles with domestic life, and then it culminates in a dinner party that all of them are present at. And I just thought that the writing in this was so incredible and descriptive, and just the way that she tackled the themes of, you know, marriage, motherhood, kind of reminiscent of what she's talking about in Aftermath and A Life's Work, and it just really worked for me. So I think that this is probably my favorite of her fiction. And then we come to Parade, which I've read twice. I read right at the end of May this year, and I read in the beginning of June. I just finished it a couple days ago for the second time. Like I mentioned earlier, it's releasing on June 18th from FSG, and I do have a pre-order of it that will hopefully be on its way to me soon, so that I can have the physical copy of it. But more to come on that one in a little bit. That is my Cusk journey so far. For those of you keeping score at home, I have not read the Bradshaw variations, In the Fold, her version of Medea, or The Lucky Ones, Saving Agnes, and The Last Supper. So that is 6 Cusks that I have left to get to. The Bradshaw variations, In the Fold, The Lucky Ones, and Saving Agnes are all novels. The Last Supper is like memoir nonfiction about her traveling to Italy. I think it has a lot to do with art. And then Medea is her retelling of the Greek tragedy by Euripides. So now that you have my kind of experiences with all of her books, like as you can see, like I mentioned, not all of them were 5-star hits for me, and I think that's okay. I think that that's just how it is whenever an author has so much material to read through. Not everything's going to be a banger, but like I mentioned earlier as well, the draw of her for me is just kind of like this wanting to understand her and wanting to see how all of her books work together to accomplish what Rachel Cusk is trying to do in her writing. So I'm sure that I'll revisit some of those that weren't my absolute favorites, and I have confidence that I'll enjoy them even more the second time around and just get so much more out of them. So you want to read Rachel Cusk. Where do you start? I would say I think there's 3 different options. I think if you really truly want to commit to the Cusk lifestyle and you want to read all of her work and you know that that's like a project that you want to take on, I think reading them in chronological order could be really interesting. I think that that's like an interesting way to tackle any author's catalog of work. It's something that I really wanted to do with Toni Morrison, but I think I screwed it up by reading Beloved back in February. I think that I went out of order with that. But I just think that it would be so interesting to see that like linear progression over time of how she's changed as an author, and just see the different ways that she's explored the themes that tend to pop up in her work. But that is quite a big undertaking, I think, and I don't know if it's like necessarily the best way to do it. So if you want kind of some jumping off points, I would say start with, where are they? A Life's Work and Aftermath, her 2 memoirs. I just feel like these are just like kind of the basis of all of her other work, even though they weren't her first books. I feel like these just really give you such an insight into what she has gone through in her life and the experiences that have made her ask the questions in her writing that she always asks about this relationship between men and women, between motherhood and creating art, and just these struggles that she explores. You also maybe want to throw in The Last Supper into this. I haven't read it yet, so I can't necessarily vouch for it, but it is her other memoir, and it talks a lot about art and travel from what I've seen about it, which I feel like really come into play in her later novels. So that also might be a good one to add into the mix. And I feel like if you like at least these 2, then you're kind of ready to expand. So Once you do the nonfiction, I think there's kind of two paths that you could take. I think that you could go in and read her older novels, everything like pre-2014, before the Outline trilogy, or you could go and read her later novels, which would be Outline, Transit, Kudos, Second Place, and now Parade. I was texting Claire whenever I was reading Parade because she also has a galley of it and was kind of toying around with the idea of starting with it, but she hasn't read much Cusk yet. And I told her that I feel like there's been this really big change from her pre-outline books to her post-outline books, and that they almost feel like two separate bodies of work to me, or like two separate authors. I think that her older books are a bit more accessible and just like really well-written literary fiction. There is more of a traditional plot and characters and just like more familiar structure to them. And I always have a really fun time with them. Her Outline trilogy and beyond, though, especially with Parade, I feel like they are just a lot more challenging. They're not as conventional as her previous works were, and she really subverts kind of these traditional ideas of like character and form and plot. Like there's a quote from an interview that she did where she said that she doesn't think that character exists anymore, and I feel like that is so well reflected in her newer work, and like it really makes you dig into it and think about it a little bit deeper in order to see what she's trying to do. So those are kind of the two paths that you could take depending on what you're in the mood for. I think it's really important to look at Rachel Cusk's entire catalog within the context of her life and the reception that her books have gotten, because there is truly a distinct shift between the pre-outline books and the post-outline books. And that's not an accident. Whenever she published Aftermath, her memoir about her divorce back in 2012, there was a lot of intense criticism, and she had faced the same thing with A Life's Work back in like 2003. Aftermath specifically is what sparked this change in her writing style and this kind of detachment from character. Olivia Sudjic looks at this in her book Exposure, which I just read recently, and which really helped me kind of formulate some of my thoughts and help me sift through my feelings about Parade. In that book, Sudjic says, "Wanting people to like you corrupts your writing, but being hated or humiliated can ruin your life. It is hard to create from a place of total evisceration. I read interviews with Cusk to remind myself of this. She describes the reception to Aftermath as threatening her with total silence. I have lost all interest in having a self. Being a person has always meant getting blamed for it." And because she was, like Sudjic says, eviscerated for this book and just like completely destroyed because of it, it really caused her to kind of pull back on representing herself in her work. Sudjic goes on to say, "Cusk's self-reflection has resulted in a writerly reinvention. While it normally seems a mistake to let criticism entirely shape your next book, in the trilogy of Outline, Transit, and Kudos, the elusive narrator has done just that. She's still radically honest, but is now a medium for other lives. Strangers expose themselves to her." I feel like Sudjic says it a lot more concisely than I can, but yeah, it's just so true. Like, Cusk really began kind of obscuring herself in her more recent books, starting with Outline, and so there is quite a shift. So while that style might not always work for me specifically, I think knowing kind of the reasons why and knowing that context for it helps me to appreciate what she's doing a lot more. And I feel like it's not something that people always talk about whenever they talk about Outline, and I just think that it's helpful context to have. So hopefully if you kind of face the same struggles with her newer work that I have, maybe that kind of clears it up for you a little bit. She's done a lot of interviews that are really fascinating, kind of talking about this idea of character and this like silence that she faced after writing Aftermath. So to sum it all up, if I was going to create like a Rachel Cusk starter pack, if I was going to choose 4 books for you to start with, I would go with Aftermath and A Life's Work, just because I feel like they're really thematically relevant to all of her other work. I would do Arlington Park, just because this is my favorite of her older fiction, and I feel like it ties in really nicely with her two memoirs. And I would also go with Outline, just because I feel like this is so widely loved. Like, this is kind of the Cusk that people talk about, and I feel like it is really like the basis for where she's gone since publishing this, and I think that it kind of shows you some insight into the future of where Rachel Cusk is going to be going with her work. We haven't really talked too much about Parade. I will say I don't think that it's the place to start with Cusk, and that's not because it's bad. It's not bad. It's very complex and thought-provoking, and she's doing a lot with it. It's really hard for me to just like distill that book into a single description, but because it's so opaque and just different formally and structurally, I think that it could put you off of her work if you're not already acquainted with it. So that is why I would not recommend starting with Parade. That being said though, let's actually talk about Parade. I was so incredibly excited to receive a digital galley of this book from FSG. Like, I was on my break at work and I almost screamed in the break room whenever I got the email that I was approved for it. So exciting. This is the first book that she's released since I have become a fan of hers, I believe. I might be lying. Yeah, Second Place came out in 2021, probably right around the time that I was like starting to read her. So the release of this book is like a major event for me. And before I get into it, I do want to say Nathan's Nook just put out a really incredible video. Him and Renee from The Left-Handed Reader did a buddy read of Parade, and he just put out a vlog about it, and I absolutely loved hearing his thoughts. I think that that is a really great video to check out if you're curious about the book. I watched it kind of in sections while I was doing my reread of Parade, and it was just a really great companion and provided some insight into the book. So highly recommend checking that out. So I went into Parade at the end of May, kind of expecting it to be more of like a traditional novelistic structure, kind of along the lines of like Second Place or Arlington Park. That is not what this is. Parade is split into 4 different sections. We have the stuntman, the midwife, the diver, and the spy. All of the sections are dealing with different artists. All of the artists are named G. Some of them are men, some of them are women. They are different races. They use different mediums, but they all share the same name. And she kind of mixes these stories about their life and their work with a first-person narrator, and then eventually there is like a we. I forget what that like voice is called. First person plural. And in all of these sections, Rachel Cusk is exploring the same handfuls of themes. She's looking at femininity and violence and parenthood and death and freedom, and she's just using all of these artists to kind of explore those themes. My first read through of it, I was so caught up in like the excitement of reading a new book by my favorite author, and I just like feel like I set such high expectations because I was like pressuring myself to try and put all of these pieces together, and I was thinking like, okay, there's gonna be this, you know, resolution at the end where all of these artists like come together or something like that, and I was trying to anticipate what she was going to do, and that really kind of overshadowed my first read through of it. So I decided to reread it shortly after finishing my first read through. Now that I knew what to expect, I wanted to focus more on the themes and just the writing, because ultimately no matter what she's writing about, she just uses language in such a stunning way. And I just wanted to appreciate that a bit more the second time around. So we start out with the stuntman, and I'm gonna be probably looking down at my notes a lot more here. I have been like going through kind of my Cusk journey and my overall thoughts on her like in my brain so much over the past couple weeks, so I feel like I really nailed that. But my thoughts on Parade are a lot more scattered and hard to distill. So forgive me for looking at my notes here, but the stuntman starts out with a male painter named G, and he begins to paint upside down. And he's married, and his wife has a really visceral reaction to these upside down paintings because she feels like they are this like reflection of what it feels like to be a woman, where everything kind of looks right but feels wrong. And G is praised for these paintings, but he's still really hostile to like the outside world because he had received a lot of criticism for some of his earlier work, which I thought was kind of like an interesting parallel with Cusk's earlier work getting such a intense critical reception, and just the fact that like he was still really loved and admired for his work, even though he wanted nothing to do with kind of the like art world. I feel like maybe a female artist would not still get that same attention if she wasn't willing to kind of play the game. And with this relationship between G and his wife, she's kind of exploring this idea that also came up in Art Monsters by Elkin, where men are able to be artists because of this like unseen labor that women do in caring for like children in the house and things like that. So G in the book has this opinion that women can't be artists because he sees his wife and what she does, and he just doesn't associate her with the ability to create art. And she, on the other hand, feels this really deep obligation to support him and be supportive of his work. And she almost has this sense of like ownership over his success because she's given up so much in order for him to be successful. She feels like she's, you know, really played this big role, which she has, and she's just given up so much for it. So she feels kind of this connection to his success. And then we switch into this first person narrator, which I believe, if I'm remembering correctly from Nathan's video, this part starts to talk about something that actually did happen to Cusk in real life. This first person narrator is just like randomly attacked in the street, and I believe that did happen to Cusk, but it kind of just shatters her sense of self and her view of the world. She really struggles to reconcile the events of the attack with the image that she has of herself, and that's where the idea of the stuntman comes in, where the stuntman is in kind of this projection of you that takes on this like physical violence, and that's what allows you to kind of create yourself and take risks. So that was like a very interesting concept to me. I struggled at times kind of following her train of thought there. I think that this first section is definitely the most opaque and difficult to understand. The writing in it can be very dense and just very intellectual, so you do kind of have to really sit there and like dissect the sentences to understand what she is trying to get at. But she brings back the idea of this like inversion and like upside downness with this first person narrator, because she talks about how after being attacked, the sense of self became really small, and then the danger of the outside world became very large, where I think with people a lot of the times, you know, you kind of are the center of your own universe, and yourself is such a big part of your life, and then the outer world can be kind of periphery. But after being attacked and kind of being a victim to that just random violence, it really inverted that idea for her. There's also this idea of the violence of like femininity and childbirth. There's a quote where she says, "Art rooted in insanity transforms itself through process into sanity. It is matter, the body, that is insane." And the woman that attacked the narrator had done it to other women before in like the same place. So the violence was repeated, but it wasn't permanent, you know? And Cusk kind of compares that to like femininity and reproduction, and you know, there's this intense pain and violence of childbirth, but like the effect of it doesn't last. I feel like rereading it, I definitely was able to grasp good lord. feel like I was able to pick up on the themes and kind of what she was trying to say a lot more the second time that I read this, but the writing was quite opaque at times. Then we move into the second section, which is the midwife, and I think that this section is my favorite part of the book. We start out talking about a female painter named G, and she's kind of really come into her own in her career. She's hit her stride and has found a lot of success, and we get to see how kind of wild and like unconventional her youth was. She was like living in a really rundown studio in the city. Her parents didn't really approve of her, and yet she still would call them on the phone every day and talk to them, and kept kind of returning to this like sense of disapproval that they would give her. And then that's contrasted with her getting older and finding a husband, starting a family, and just how conventional her life ended up becoming and how different that was from her youth. There's also this idea of her art and her painting being this like separate entity from her, and she talks about how it just kind of has like a life of its own and how it was able to sustain itself no matter what was going on in her life, which I thought was an interesting look at like the will to create and the need of artists to make art. And then we do switch into a first person narrator, and if you've read this, like maybe you guys have some insight on this. I couldn't tell if the first person narrator in the Midwife was the same as the narrator in The Stuntman. I wasn't sure if it was kind of similar to what she does with the artist named G, where there's like multiple of them and they're all different, or if it was the same I throughout the like first person section. So if you guys have any insight into that, would love to know your thoughts on it. I was really trying to like connect all of these things together whenever I was reading, and I'm not sure if that was like the right way to go about it. So this first person narrator is staying at a cottage on a farm just to kind of like escape daily life, and there's a lot of really great writing and like descriptions of landscapes and nature in here. There's almost like a harshness to it. There's this like mountain, and she talks about like all of the different sides of it and just kind of how it like watches over the valley that they were staying in. And yeah, I don't know, it wasn't like, oh, beautiful, like, you know, luscious nature. There was like this almost like barrenness and just harshness to it, but I really enjoyed that. You almost get the sense that the characters are being watched by nature. She just kind of talks about the struggle of like keeping nature untouched by humanity. There's also this description of a farmhouse, and the room that she's talking about is like super messy, and like random connection. It just reminded me of the way that she described the children's rooms in Arlington Park. I think that was a scene that I had brought up in my March wrap up whenever I was talking about Arlington Park, was just the vivid imagery of the messy children's rooms. And yeah, that farmhouse like brought me back to that. And then we go back to that same artist G. There's some really interesting scenes with her and her husband. She kind of changes herself and becomes very passive as a result of her relationship with her husband, but whenever she had her daughter, she almost kind of came back to herself as a result of having a child, and she had this really strong urge to take the baby and run away from her husband. But there's kind of this exploration that I think she goes into in a life's work as well, of like, does a mother have like sole ownership of the child just because they are the ones that like physically gave birth to it? Because we see with like the husband, he kind of threatens like, oh yeah, sure, if you want to leave you can, but I'm gonna keep the child and you're gonna have to pay like all of this money, and just like kind of the like legal and bureaucratic things that go into separating. And that also reminded me of some of the scenes with the first person narrator in this section. The like owner of the farm is kind of this like really erratic man. He has a wife and a daughter, and the wife and daughter end up moving out of the farmhouse to kind of escape him. So I felt like there were some parallels there, and just kind of like these connections and relationships between women and like mothers and daughters, and kind of the struggle of them versus the men in their lives. The third section is the diver, and this is like such a callback to the outline trilogy. Just the way that the section is written is really reminiscent of the style of outline. We are for sure back in the like mind of the first person narrator from the first section in the stuntman who had been attacked. One of the things that I didn't mention whenever I was talking about the stuntman was that she had gone to an exhibition at an art gallery that had the work of, who I'm assuming, based on like other reviews and people talking, I believe that artist is supposed to be Louise Bourgeois. And during that exhibition, a man threw himself over the like wall, like down into the like center of the gallery and died. So once again, kind of this idea of violence and death and freedom. And the third section is following that narrator to a restaurant after the gallery, and she meets up with like the director of the gallery and some other people from the art world. We are witness to the conversation that they have over dinner. So they kind of talk about why people make art, what is the correct way to experience art. And this sent me down like a major online rabbit hole about Louise Bourgeois. I was like watching YouTube videos and reading about her work and stuff, because it's a name that I've heard before. I think she might be mentioned in Art Monsters by Lauren Elkin. But I had never really become familiar with her work, so that was kind of a fun little rabbit hole. I believe the other artists named G also correspond to some real life artists, but I haven't done as much like research into that, so I'm not 100% sure. I think Nathan might mention them in his video. So yeah, this section was kind of an interesting shift in style and just really reminded me of the outline trilogy. And finally, we have The Spy. This one is also alternating between an artist named G. This time it's a male filmmaker, and then there is this like first person plural once again, where this like we is talking about the death of their mother. One of the like major things that pops up in this book throughout all of the sections is that there are a lot of parents that are like on their deathbeds and they take a really long time to die. Every single section there is that kind of situation occurring, but I think that it's most focused on in The Spy. In one of the earlier sections, there is this kind of mention of like having a child and you're like increased because you have the child. And in this section, she talks about how after the mother of this wee group of siblings passed away, they also felt this kind of like increase in this freedom after she passed, and that ended up causing a lot of discomfort because, you know, there should have been this sense of loss instead of like increase in freedom. So it really looks at like fraught parental relationships in this section especially. She explores kind of the power that parents and especially mothers have to wound their children through like a lack of love, you know, and there's just this like physical and mental / emotional separation between parent and child that is kind of this like unbridgeable gap that causes a lot of pain. We also see that in The Diver because they talk about like mothers being artists and kind of shutting themselves off and separating themselves from their children so that they can work on their art. And I feel like that's just something that comes up in Cusk's work so often, so she is once again exploring it here. They talk about their struggle to feel love for other people, but whenever they have children of their own, that they have no issue expressing their love for their children. And it's kind of this like difference between them and their children versus like them and their mother, because there wasn't a lot of love in the relationship with their mother. And then with the filmmaker G, I have some quotes here that I wanted to talk about because I think that they are really like indicative of what Cusk herself is doing with her recent books. She says, his style, so uninterfering, drew attention to itself without meaning to. He rarely, for instance, showed his characters in close-up, believing that this was not how human beings saw one another. They expected a storyteller to demonstrate his mastery and control by resolving the confusion and ambiguity of reality, not deepening it. I feel like that's what she is doing with her work. She's not necessarily answering these questions about life. She's just kind of thinking in circles about them, and it, you know, doesn't necessarily like clear things up, but it is very interesting to think about. One of the other quotes is, in formlessness she discovered power and also a freedom from limitation. And I feel like this book isn't really written in the traditional like novelistic form, and that has freed Cusk herself from a lot of the limits of like more traditional novels. She also at one point says, the discipline of concealment yielded a rare power of observation. And I feel like that just kind of ties into what she's done with her recent work. You know, she didn't want to put herself out there like she did with her memoirs, but she still needed to find a way to explore the themes and the issues that come up in her work without like opening up all of these raw details of her life to the public. So I think by writing the way that she does and by kind of removing the self from her work, she's still finding ways to engage with those personal themes without centering on her own life and her own like actual self. One more quote to kind of also tie into that. To see without being seen. For G, there is no better definition of the artist's vocation. Yeah, I just feel like it really kind of summed up the stylistic change in her work and the reasons why she's kind of removed herself from her writing. So yeah, as you can see, it's like a lot to parse through, and I still like I still don't think that I can give you a star rating of this book. One of the things that I really loved that Nathan said in his was that he enjoyed it because of the challenge that it presented, and that's kind of where I'm leaning towards my feelings being. There's just so much to think about in this, and like I said, it's just hard to distill everything that she's doing here into a neat little review. I think that her writing, as always, is really strong. I think what she's doing with form here is unlike anything that I've ever seen before. Kind of this idea of having like a parade of different people and exploring her themes throughout all of their lives. I've never seen anything like it. I think that she's looking at the idea of the self in a really interesting way as well, because you know, you have all of these different artists named G, and it's like, are they different people? Are they kind of a representation of the many different selves that you can have? Yeah, it's just like, there's so much to it, and it has definitely been a challenging book to try and talk about, but I'm really glad that I read it and reread it. Especially, I think that this would be a completely different video if I had made it right after reading it for the first time. I think that the reread really helped me to appreciate everything that she's doing here. I've just been yapping about Rachel Cusk literally for over an hour, I think. Special stuff. I hope that this was helpful to you in some way. If you're curious about Rachel Cusk, you know, I hope that this gave you some sort of jumping off point to read her. I know it can be really intimidating with an author that has as many books as she does to kind of figure out where to start. So hopefully this gave you some insight. If you've read Parade already, please give me your thoughts down in the comments. I would love to work through all of these things that I've brought up in this video with others that have also read it, just because there's so much that you can talk about with it. If you're into this kind of thing, if you love literary fiction and creative nonfiction like I do, consider subscribing. This is the kind of thing that we do here, and it's just really fun to discuss this stuff with other like-minded people. So I would love to have you. And yeah, just give me all of your Rachel Cusk thoughts in the comments. I would love to talk about her with others. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.